Hey, everybody, welcome back. So, I want to talk about the concept of tradition and maybe some of the challenges of appealing to tradition in conversations, especially between Catholics and Protestants, or Eastern Orthodox and Protestants, and maybe even Oriental Orthodox and Protestants. Although I think that everybody will benefit from this conversation, but the question usually arises in this context, right? Kind of a sola scriptura versus a tradition-based approach. Not to say that there aren't some Protestants that have a role and room for tradition in a qualified way. But that's usually when we see these conversations. And, I've done videos before where I've talked about some of the difficulties of appealing to the Bible alone. And I've talked about this actually for quite some time because admittedly there are considerable challenges with just determining what exactly is the Bible, right? Of course, you famously have the canon question, which books belong in the Bible. And obviously, you also have the consideration of whose interpretation once we have established which books belong in the Bible. But in most cases, most people don't ever get to this third layer of that conversation. And that is, which manuscripts do we use to reconstruct what we say is the Bible, right? Since we don't have any original manuscripts, we have to attempt to reconstruct what the original looked like. And often involved in that conversation is a discussion of textual criticism and an examination of biblical manuscripts. And there are admittedly a lot of challenges to this. I've actually talked about this in my lectures at rtcourses.com, specifically in the course on encountering the manuscripts. And I show a lot of the challenges, between when the book was supposed to have been written and our earliest manuscripts. In some cases, there may be 1,000 years of a gap in between without any kind of oral passing down, oral transmission in any kind of memorized fashion of that text. And so without manuscript evidence in that pretty large gap, it poses some challenges with reconstructing the original, in addition to the fact that we have a lot of variants in many cases for various books. And so which reading is original? This is why, as I've pointed out, most scholars, whether they are committed to the Bible believing scholars or not, I think most of them come away with, rather than having a conversation about reconstructing the original, it seems like a lot of them have abandoned that. They would rather speak of reconstructing the earliest attainable text. So they've kind of backed away from the conversation of what the original is, and more conversations on let's reconstruct the earliest attainable, as far as back as we can get, but not necessarily saying that this is the original. And look, there are some like Catholic biblical scholars that I know very, very committed to the Bible, very faithful to the magisterium, but they will readily admit that they don't believe that the Bible can be reconstructed to its original. Of course, they'll also say that's not a problem because you have the role of tradition and you have the magisterium. And that's kind of what we're exploring here in this question here. And so a lot of times that difficulty of reconstructing the Bible is presented as a bigger problem for people who maintain sola scriptura, the Bible alone, since they don't have a magisterium and they don't have a tradition informing the text, informing the canon, informing the proper interpretation of the text. So it's more of a difficulty, admittedly, for a Protestant than, say, a Catholic and Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, Assyrian Church of the East, any of the apostolic churches. Okay, so because of that conversation of whether we can or cannot reconstruct the original text, and again, that's a whole conversation in and of itself. It introduces the question of tradition in the magisterium, because Usually, again, a Protestant is going to have a great deal of difficulty with having any conversation about reconstructing the original text. But usually you'll see with any of the apostolic churches, at this point, there will be an appeal to tradition, and also to the magisterium in some particular cases, namely in Catholicism. So that kind of brings up the question then of, how do we establish tradition, right? How do we appeal to this to help inform the text and also to help fill in the gap for that difficulty of trying to determine what is the Bible and what is the proper interpretation. So that's when it kind of brings up the question of, first of all, tradition. So what exactly is tradition? I mean, there's a lot of different ways to define it, and I've had many streams talking about 11 or 12 different definitions to it, but most commonly it's being used to refer to what's called sacred tradition, and this would be divine revelation. So divine revelation given by God, and then disclosed by Jesus in his earthly ministry, and also by the apostles in their earthly ministry. So divine tradition, divine apostolic tradition, as it's often called. But sacred tradition is here understood to be divine revelation, right? Just as scripture would be divine revelation, but written down in a written form, sacred tradition would be divine revelation, but orally proclaimed, something spoken, and maybe even spoken prior to writing down the text or writing down the scripture. Of course, you have other ways in which people use the term tradition. Maybe they're referring to what's called ecclesiastical tradition. It's not divine revelation. It wasn't revealed by God, but it's something that the church has created in order to help better facilitate an appreciation for tradition. So an ecclesiastical tradition example of that would be the rosary or something like that. But when we're having this conversation today, it's important to keep in mind we are not talking about ecclesiastical traditions or any other kind. We're specifically talking about sacred tradition, divine revelation. Okay, so one of the difficulties and challenges of appealing to tradition is it's not this thing that you can just go and buy off the shelf, right? We have to have a way to identify what exactly it is. And so you can look at some of the scholastic manuals by guys like Emmanuel Duranzo in his work Channels of Revelation, and he will appeal to a number of places to kind of determine what sacred tradition is. He will appeal to ecumenical councils. He'll appeal to the magisterium. He will appeal to the liturgy. He will appeal to sacred art, and also apostolic succession, also the church fathers, also preaching. A lot of locations, if you will, that will be appealed to in these manuals. And let's maybe look at each one of them and some of the challenges that are involved with each one of them, because this is going to come up in any conversation with a well-informed person, whether they're Protestant or not. And this might also help you maybe appreciate why some of the more educated Protestants maybe have some difficulty with the question of tradition. It's, I know maybe in popular perception, the idea is that Protestants are all just dumb. They don't know anything. They're just stupid. And if they just understood the arguments for tradition or something like that, they would see how all the problems are solved. Look, with every group, there's some people who are less informed and others who are more informed, right? And if you speak to maybe some of the more informed ones, they're going to point out some of these challenges, right? So this is not a secret. This isn't anything unique in my own observations, but these are just things that maybe to be aware of as you have conversations with people on the topic of tradition, because it will inevitably come up in these conversations, at least again with any kind of informed person. So let's maybe start with the idea of the passing down of tradition, which is actually what the term means in Latin. It means handing down. So I remember watching this debate with James White years and years and years ago, and I think he was debating. I think he was debating a Catholic apologist on the topic of tradition, and he was looking for a mechanism to identify tradition, which is reasonable, right? It's reasonable for him to ask, okay, how do I identify what is tradition? So he's looking for some kind of objective mechanism to identify this, and I think that he said, like, how is this passed down? Is it where you have like a cardinal in some, back corridor in the Vatican who, or in some back room, whispers to another cardinal and passes down the tradition to him and says, hey, here's what the tradition is. And then it's passed down that way, right? Kind of this verbal oral transmission that's passed down from one cardinal to another, or maybe one bishop to another. And obviously he wasn't being serious when he asked that, but he is basically asking, like, well, okay, what is the method by which this is transmitted? And look, there admittedly is no unbroken chain of any kind of oral transmission of tradition being passed down from one person to another, from one bishop to another. That's just not the mechanism by which this was done. We don't have any evidence of that in any kind of unbroken and consistent way. There might be some cases where you do find a passing down of some of these things from one bishop to another on a few points, on a few doctrines. I can think of maybe a few examples of this in the patristic literature, but there's no consistent, unbroken chain of one bishop passing down to another, an oral presentation of what tradition is in some kind of way that goes from the first century all the way to the present. There's nothing like that. The closest thing would be apostolic succession. But apostolic succession is not necessarily a passing down of tradition in some kind of oral way. You won't find any real claims that that is exactly what apostolic succession is anyway. That's just not what the claim is. Apostolic succession is the handing down of holy orders, sacred orders, the sacrament of ordination, the passing down of the episcopate specifically is what we're talking here when we speak of apostolic succession, in its fullest sense, at least. And so along with that might be some catechesis, right? It could be that the bishop who consecrates you a bishop, it could be that they do catechize you with some teachings, and that might include some tradition. But in many cases, the person who ordained you isn't necessarily the one who catechized you. And in fact, that's the case for a lot of church history. It might just actually be a neighboring bishop who consecrates you, comes into the area, consecrates you along with a few others, and they're not necessarily catechizing you and telling you what tradition is. Depending on just what the time period is, you may have received your catechesis from someone or some other group. Although not limited to those things, it could be that you actually did receive catechesis directly from the bishop who consecrated you, and that may have included some tradition. But to say that that was the case for every ordination or even consistently, and that there was a full explanation of what tradition is, not just some elements, but the full explanation by the one consecrating you, look, that just doesn't exist in church history. That's not what apostolic succession is. So while it may include an element of catechesis, it's more a focus on ordination specifically. So I think another one of the challenges with the apostolic succession, just a raw appeal to apostolic succession here for transmission of what tradition is look, of course, the Gnostics and other groups claimed apostolic succession as well. They also had their lists of who they say they were consecrated by. going back to the apostles. Whether their lists were bogus or not, different question. But they likely, or not likely, they certainly, I can give some examples, had their lists as well, in addition to guys like Irenaeus, or maybe Eusebius, who lists some of the succession lists. And by the way, those succession lists that you'll see described by Irenaeus and described by Eusebius and others are not necessarily lists of one bishop consecrating another bishop, but rather they're listing, here's the bishop of Rome, and here's the next bishop of Rome, and here's the next bishop of Rome. But they're not saying, but this bishop of Rome consecrated as bishop this guy who became bishop of Rome, who consecrated this guy as bishop of Rome. That's not the way it happened in the majority of cases for episcopal lists, like the bishop of Rome or the bishops of Antioch or Alexandria or Constantinople or Jerusalem or whatever patriarchate you have in mind. Likely your consecrator was not necessarily the one who possessed the episcopal see that you're going to maintain. You might be coming from somewhere else and brought into that episcopal see, and you were consecrated by a bishop in the middle of nowhere, right? Keep that in mind when it comes to those episcopal lists. They're not necessarily saying this person consecrated that person, consecrated that person. Rather, they're saying this person sat in that office, this person sat in that office, this person sat in that office. Just like I can say, Obama was president, then, Trump, then Biden, then Trump. That doesn't mean like Obama made Trump president and Trump made Biden president. That's not the way it worked. I'm just telling you who sat in that office, right? Be that as it may. Look, a lot of the heterodox communities maintained episcopal lists, rival episcopal lists as well, in addition to the fact that these are not necessarily consecration episcopal lists, let alone this person passed down tradition to this person who passed it down to this person. It's not like, well, in this episcopal list, it's Linus, Clement, Cletus. I don't remember the exact episcopal list for the Bishop of Rome, but those are some of the names in the early lists. And it's not like Linus gave it to Cletus, who gave it to Anacletus, who gave it to Clement. That's not the way it works. It's not that Linus told Clement, here's the traditions, and then he told it to there's no claim that they're passing down information that way. And certainly we know later on these lists include people possessing this office who didn't even know the predecessor, right? Didn't even know the previous bishop of Rome, let alone did they receive tradition directly from them. So this is why you cannot just simply say, well, apostolic succession ensures a passing down of tradition, in addition to the obvious fact that there are obviously different apostolic churches with different conflicting views on tradition, right? I mean, Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. Is the filioque sacred tradition or not? Is papal infallibility, papal supremacy sacred tradition or not? Is the essence and energies distinction sacred tradition or not? Immaculate Conception, you name it. Like one group is going to say one thing, the other group is going to say another. So there's different apostolic communities with different conceptions of what tradition is. So a raw appeal to apostolic succession or an apostolic community for any student of history, that's just not going to answer the question. It might narrow it down a little bit more to those communities, but it doesn't settle anything. And again, if you've ever seen a debate between a Catholic theologian and an Eastern Orthodox theologian, that would become very apparent, right? Okay. What about councils? So you'll see in some of these manuals an appeal to councils to be a witness to what constitutes sacred tradition? Well, first of all, you have to ask, like, which councils? Most likely what is meant here is an ecumenical council or an ecumenical synod. There are some ignorant people out there who think that there's a distinction between an ecumenical council and a synod. Maybe in common speech today there is. In ancient times, in the early patristic literature, an ecumenical synod is the same as an ecumenical council. Although there are lower versions of councils. You do have local councils, aka local synods. You might have a national council, and there's, again, various categories for today as well. Regardless of what you call it, whether you call it a synod or whether you call it a council, either way, what's often meant in these conversations when there's an appeal to a council to define what or identify what is tradition, what is meant by that is an ecumenical council. But I've brought up this point many, many times that who determines what an ecumenical council is? Is it just something called by an emperor and determined by an emperor? Is this something that has been ratified by 5 patriarchates? Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Jerusalem? Is this something that at the very least was ratified at least by Rome? Is this something that the whole church community, the whole ecclesial community accepts and receives as an ecumenical council? There are many different and competing definitions on what an ecumenical council is. You'll often, again, encounter these in debates between, again, Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, but not limited to those debates. But sure, like we could say an ecumenical council, once we've identified what that is, and what constitutes one, we could say an ecumenical council witnesses to tradition. But there's some further work that goes into that, because is everything that the council teaching a witness to tradition? Some will hold to that view, actually. Some will say that, yes, everything that an ecumenical council witnesses to is infallible or inerrant and is an identification of what is passed on from the apostles. And others will have a little bit more of a qualified approach to that and say, well, some ecumenical councils could technically get some things wrong, or at the very least are not necessarily saying that everything it's confirming is tradition. Maybe they're confirming a discipline, maybe they're confirming a teaching, but in a non-definitive way. There's a ton of debates on that question as well. Again, some of these are debates between Catholics and Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox, and some of these are debates within one community, like the Catholic Church. Just within the Catholic Church, there are competing views on ecumenical councils, and of course, the level of teachings that they offer in all cases. Can they teach non-definitively? Can they teach definitively? There's also the added challenge of identifying the proper sessions of an ecumenical council. There's a huge debate on which sessions belong to the Council of Florence, for example. Are the sessions from the early sessions from the Council of Basel, the first 25 sessions, are they actually part of the Council of Florence, Ferrara, Rome, as it's often called, because it was actually held in 4 different cities: Basel, Ferrara, Florence, and Rome. So which sessions, right? Is it just the first 25 sessions of Basel that is part of the Council of Florence? Is it the ones after that? What about this council and these sessions over here? In addition to the question of, okay, what's our earliest attestations to these sessions? We might be looking at a manuscript that tells us, okay, session 3 of the Lateran Council, and it might be 500 years removed from the 4th Lateran Council or something, right? So there's still that additional question of, what did the council actually say, right? And some of those debates continue to this day on, okay, what did Florence actually say? Or what did Nicaea actually say? Or what did Chalcedon actually say? What did it actually confirm? And there's a lot of debates on these things, even just within the apostolic churches, and sometimes even within an individual community, an individual church. So there are some challenges with the question of councils. Church fathers often comes up, right? The patristic literature. Well, of course, an educated Protestant is going to point out, for example, that who you identify as a church father is going to maybe be a challenge, because who a Protestant might identify as a church father isn't always necessarily the same as who an Eastern Orthodox would identify as a church father. And there are differences between what constitutes a church father between, for example, the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches. So you'll have different criteria to identify who is a church father. Is there a time period that kind of cuts this off to where anybody who comes after that is no longer a church father? There's a lot of debates on that. Some would consider people like Origen a church father. Others would say he's an ecclesiastical writer and also a heretic. Others would say, well, no, I don't accept that he was a heretic. I think he was wrongly condemned, but I'll say he's an ecclesiastical writer. And others will say, I think he's a saint and he's going to be rehabilitated. And there's a lot of different views on just one guy, right? Origen. But okay, even with church fathers, let's say we identify Augustine as a church father, right? And there are some ecumenical councils shared by both Catholics and Orthodox that identify specifically Augustine as a church father. Does that include all of his writings? Are all of his writings a witness and testimony to tradition? I don't know anybody who would argue that. Certainly from the Catholic perspective, there are some things that Augustine taught that were wrong, that would now be deemed to be completely inadmissible and unacceptable. He maintained, for example, that infants must receive communion to be saved. I think most, at the very least in the Latin Rite today, would argue against that. And I think most Eastern Catholics would also argue against that. But that was there in Augustine, right? And so now there's kind of a determining of, all right, what do we take from Augustine? What do we reject? And even among the Eastern Orthodox, they might accept some of his writings, as the council does, but then reject other writings that maybe testifies to the filioque. So even once you've identified a church father, it doesn't necessarily tell you that everything they're witnessing to is tradition. In addition to the difficulty of what did the church father actually write? What did he actually say? Our manuscripts for some of these church fathers might be 1,000 years after the time in which they wrote. It's a pretty large gap. We may have discovered a manuscript for something that, Basil wrote or Augustine wrote or just whoever. We may have discovered it only in the last century or so. There could be a very large gap between when they lived, when they wrote, and our earliest attestation to what they wrote, in addition to conflicts when we have multiple manuscripts with variants. And this actually came up at the Council of Florence, because there was a huge debate on, okay, did Basil teach the filioque? Did this church father teach filioque? And the Latins were saying yes, and here's my manuscript where Basil teaches it. And the Greeks were coming back saying, well, our manuscript doesn't testify to this. When we pull up Basil in our register, we pull up his manuscript off the shelf here, or we go back to Constantinople to get it, or we write to them to get it. They're telling us that that's not in our manuscript. And so the thing is, there were these major debates on what did the church father actually say and teach. And so that poses a huge challenge, because it kind of brings you into a textual criticism of the church fathers, right? We got a textual criticism of the Bible, trying to reconstruct the Bible. Then we got to reconstruct an ecumenical council through the manuscripts. Now we got to reconstruct what the church fathers said through the manuscripts. And there will be competing and conflicting answers. And in addition, by the way, to the ecumenical councils, in some Catholic lists of the councils, there will be this many canons. And some Orthodox lists of the same council, there will be a different number of canons. So sometimes the Orthodox accepted these canons, sometimes the Catholics didn't. Sometimes this canon was added to the council 10, 20 years after the council ended, and is just appended to the council. And so it's among this group, but it's not among this group. And so which canons, right? Well, you might find different answers. And certainly in the conversation with papal supremacy, you'll find different conflicting canons for some of these councils. You will also find, again, different interpretations and even different accounts of the acts of the council, right? In the Greek edition of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, it might not have all of those more explicit talking points of papal supremacy that you find in the Seventh Ecumenical Council in the Latin manuscripts. Who's right? Did somebody take something out? Did somebody add something? You have to get into all those debates. So just kind of a raw appeal to a council or a church father probably isn't going to settle it for your average Protestant who may be kind of informed on these things. Then, of course, you have the liturgy, right? But there's the question of which liturgy, right? The very earliest liturgies, we don't have any attestation to in any kind of detail. We might have a few descriptions in a very basic way, and maybe someone like Justin Martyr, but that's second century. That's not even telling us early second century or late first century necessarily. And it's not telling us what the liturgy looked like over here as opposed to over there. And so the very earliest liturgies, at best, we have a few descriptions of just some basic points, basic details, nothing like really substantive to really give us a thorough examination of the liturgy. We start to get some actual accounts of liturgies by the 4th century. Then you can start to kind of compare what we have available to us today. And obviously there's been a great deal of development and changes to these liturgies. So even if we're speaking about the Roman Rite when, at what time, in what time period, there could be some differences depending on the time period, and we can say the same of other liturgies. And so you would have to ask the question, which liturgy and when and what time period. And the other issue with the liturgy is that you might find some significant differences. The earliest liturgy that we have available that is actually still around today does not have the words of institution. This is my body, this is my blood. It's just not there. The Council of Trent says it's essential to have the words of institution. And so somebody actually noticed that difficulty. Well, if one of the earliest liturgies doesn't have the words of institution and Trent says it's essential, how does that work here? And the Vatican, attempted to offer a response to that at one point. It's a non-authoritative response, but it kind of tried to grapple with the question because it's a legitimate question. But you can see in asking that question, a raw appeal to liturgy doesn't settle it. And the reality is liturgies are often a reflection of a predetermined theology. And so what comes into the liturgy as far as theology was already determined prior to that element in the liturgy. You can certainly say that you can draw your theology from the liturgy, but I think, as some popes have noted, but ultimately the theology is what informed that liturgy to begin with. So again, it kind of assumes that there's something prior to that liturgy. You might also find some appeals to art, sacred art. Again, I could think of Duranzo, who kind of appeals to sacred art as well as kind of a way to identify what is tradition. Look, art itself is often in dispute, though, right? I can think of some icons in Eastern Orthodoxy that depict God the Father. And some also in Oriental Orthodoxy that depict God the Father. If you go to the Holy Sepulchre, you'll actually see some of the Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox in there with icons of God the Father. Others will say you cannot and should not depict God the Father, right? You might find an icon of a pope fighting against the church. I've seen some Eastern Orthodox icons that have like the Pope attacking the ship of the church, like the church is depicted as a ship and the Pope is attacking it. Obviously, that's not going to inform a Catholic perspective on what sacred tradition teaches on the papacy. That would be in conflict with it, in fact. So whose art maybe is kind of the question here. And different forms of art themselves are kind of in dispute, right? There is a pretty old debate on can you depict things in 3D, or does it have to be in 2D? Does it have to be an icon, or could it actually be a statue? And so again, it already kind of assumes that there's a predetermined theology that's known prior to an evaluation of art. And lastly, maybe preaching. It could be pointed out that the way in which tradition was often passed down in antiquity was through a proclamation, through preaching. Maybe a bishop is preaching and teaching something, and that's a passing down of tradition to the congregation. It's not necessarily a passing down of the liturgy to the person who's consecrated next, but at least to the community, right? But obviously you have heretical preaching, right? You got bishops out there teaching all sorts of wild things and preaching some wild stuff. So again, it assumes that there already is a way to identify sound tradition prior to evaluating a preaching, because nobody says, well, it was preached in a sermon, therefore it's tradition. Basil preached this. Augustine preached this. Chrysostom preached it, therefore it's tradition. Very few people would maintain that, right? Most people would scrutinize it a little bit more and say, well, just because it was preached doesn't necessarily mean, even if it was preached by a church father and a saint, doesn't necessarily mean that it's a witness to tradition in all cases. Cyprian and what he was witnessing to with rebaptism, he was claiming that was apostolic tradition. But the Pope was saying, no, we have a different apostolic tradition, and it excludes rebaptism. And they're both saints. They're both in the patristic period. But they're giving conflicting explanations of what tradition is. They're both saying it's apostolic. They're both preaching the message, but they're in conflict with each other. Who's right? So again, just kind of an appeal to preaching doesn't answer this really for anyone. But there is an interesting one here, and that is the magisterium, right? I say all of this to kind of bring you to what Pope Paul VI himself says. Pope Paul VI recently declared a saint in the Catholic Church. Paul VI obviously was over the vast majority of the Second Vatican Council. And he recognized all of these challenges and difficulties. And he recognized it because he was having challenges with the SSPX. Yes, the issue with Lefebvre goes back to even Paul VI. as I've pointed out in my lectures on the SSPX. Lefebvre said, look, there are some people right now, Paul VI said there are some people right now, Lefebvre and others, who are rejecting the Second Vatican Council, Paul VI. He says they're rejecting it because they're saying that Vatican II does not teach in accordance with tradition. Paul VI recognizes the challenge here. Does he just simply tell them, well, look to the liturgy or look to, icons or art and look to this church? No, he doesn't. He gets to the heart of the matter because he recognizes every one of the challenges I just presented to you. And what does he offer as a solution? Well, let me actually show it to you. Share my screen and show you what Paul VI says. This is from his allocution. I've spoken about this before. On May 24th, 1976. He says, maybe zoom in on that. It is even affirmed that the Second Vatican Council is not binding, that the faith would be in danger also because of the post-conciliar reforms and guidelines, which there is a duty to disobey and to preserve certain traditions. Sound familiar? It should. Many people are saying, hey, Vatican II changed some of the traditions, and we have to go before Vatican II to really get the full understanding of tradition. I don't know a lot of people who say that. And some don't just say that with Vatican II. Maybe the Eastern Orthodox will say, well, actually, before this Pope, the Catholic Church was teaching tradition, but now after this Pope or now after this council, it's no longer teaching tradition. But here he's dealing with Catholics who are saying, you have to reject Vatican II because it has abandoned certain traditions, right? And that's the position of the SSPX. Paul says, what traditions? Does it belong to this group, that is the SSPX, or even just regular critics of Vatican II? Does it belong to this group and not the Pope, not the Episcopal College, not an ecumenical council to establish which of the countless traditions must be regarded as the norm of faith? So what is he doing here? He's ultimately saying it's the magisterium. He doesn't say ecumenical council alone because he already knows, how do you determine what an ecumenical council is? Well, according to Vatican II, you would identify it by what the Pope ratifies as an ecumenical council, papal ratification. So he doesn't just say, well, you just look to an ecumenical council. He doesn't just say, well, you look to the College of Bishops because, okay, which group of bishops? The Orthodox, are you going to include them? No, you're going to ultimately do the one that's in communion with the Pope. That's why he mentions the Pope first. So what is he ultimately saying? He's saying, how do you identify tradition? The magisterium identifies tradition. Not this group, not that group. So not Lefebvre, not the Eastern Orthodox, not this council in Constantinople, but rather the magisterium, the Catholic magisterium in communion with the Pope identifies what tradition is. So what does that then boil down to? What that boils down to is sacred tradition is what the magisterium says sacred tradition is. So it becomes an appeal to authority. It becomes an appeal to the magisterium. So you might come along and say, I think sacred tradition is X, Y, and Z, but it becomes a private opinion. Ultimately, how are you going to authoritatively say these things? Well, you have to say, well, the church says, the magisterium teaches, this is tradition. Obviously, there's some additional difficulties with that. I mean, that I've discussed a long time here talking about the magisterium. There are different magisterial evaluations on some topics, how the magisterium taught on this doctrine in this century is not necessarily what it taught later. Maybe it reversed that teaching. So what it witnesses to as tradition in this century isn't always the same as what it says is tradition in a later time. This is something that is most interesting to me because it pertains to the area I'm most fascinated with, and that is doctrinal reversals and magisterial reversals. So There's plenty of examples of that. I've discussed some of them here. But then even a raw appeal to magisterium doesn't always get you where you want to go, because you could always ask, well, the magisterium in what time period? Are we talking about like presently or in the past? The response, by the way, that the magisterium gives to that is that the living magisterium, the current magisterium, is the authentic interpreter of the past magisterium. So it boils down to an appeal to authority. How do you know what tradition is? What the magisterium says it is. Well, if there's a conflict in what the magisterium says tradition is, it's the magisterium that tells you what is the proper interpretation of the magisterium. So it just boils down to the magisterium says it. Where does the magisterium get its authority from? You would appeal to the Bible and tradition. But you see the circularity now, right? And this is what, look, your average Protestant is going to point out. I remember when I first became Catholic, I was talking to a Protestant who didn't really know a whole lot about anything. But even he picked up on that fact, and he would ask, like, okay, what's tradition and what's this and that? And often it reduced to, well, the magisterium says. And then he's like, okay, so what you're saying is tradition just equals what the magisterium says. But then he's like, well, isn't that circular? Because the magisterium depends on the Bible, the magisterium depends on tradition, but then you have to use the magisterium to determine what the Bible is and to determine what tradition is. So yes, admittedly, in that sense, in that aspect, there is some circularity there. So that's been something that I've kind of noted, and many other people have observed as well. And I think that there's always going to be that level of circularity in these appeals, whether you're Catholic, whether you're Eastern Orthodox, whether you're Protestant. There's always going to be that circularity here. Unless you could somehow ground the claims of the magisterium without an appeal to scripture and without an appeal to tradition. But I don't know exactly how you would do that. Maybe if some of y'all have an idea, let me know. But it seems to me the only way to ground the authority for the magisterium is by an appeal to Matthew 16, 18 through 19, and other places that may refer to the papacy or the college of bishops or the passing down of episcopal consecration through the laying on of hands, and then how that is properly understood through the Orthodox community. And all of that is informed by tradition and ecumenical councils and so on and so forth. So there, again, admittedly, is an element of circularity there. But that's ultimately the solution that Paul VI presents here. Is it boils down to an appeal to what the church says. Without a magisterium, however, right, without that teaching authority, you are at that point kind of left with, instead of appealing to what the church says, you're left with my interpretation of what I think the Bible is, my interpretation of what I think a council taught, my interpretation of what I think tradition is. So you can either appeal to yourself, or you can appeal to another party, like a magisterium or something. But there's always an appeal to something in these conversations. But these are some of the challenges involved. And maybe keep that in mind. Maybe cut a little bit more grace for maybe a Protestant, if you're talking to a Protestant in the future. There's a lot of people who just, again, kind of treat Protestants like, they're just all dumb. If they just knew a little bit more from the church fathers or an ecumenical council or a little bit more about tradition, they'd realize how dumb they are and how smart we are. In some cases, some people might be very ignorant of those things, but in others, they're aware. They just recognize there's some additional challenges that have to be overcome here. And so maybe cut them some slack and show a little bit more grace and respect and also humility, because admittedly there are a lot of challenges here, and it's not a slam dunk. It's not one of those things of Protestants don't have tradition, we do, and therefore we're better. And it's as simple as this. Anybody who's thought through these questions, like I've attempted to do for a very long time now, I've been thinking through this question in particular since It would have probably been 2010 or 2011. That's been what, 15, 16 years? Yeah, 15, 16 years. I think, if my math is mathing. 15, 16 years that I've been thinking about these things. Wow. Yeah. Because it was right around then that I started to really evaluate the question of Protestantism versus Anglicanism versus Catholicism versus Eastern Orthodoxy. And yes, I know some people include Anglicans among the Protestants, right? Some don't, though. But I was evaluating all those questions. It brought to me to mind these conversations, and I began to evaluate them then. And I suppose this is the fruit of that evaluation for quite some time now. And that is, when you initially maybe come into some of these conversations, you just think it's like a slam dunk. It's so easy. Hey, the council says this, and that kind of settles it. You don't get into the deeper layers of the conversation until you really get challenged by more educated and informed people who are aware of debates on this or that session of a council. I remember coming across somebody early on with the Council of Constance. And you might just think, well, hey, the Council of Constance taught it, right? It's an ecumenical council, at least for the Catholic perspective. But then you have discussions on, well, is Haec Sancta in that session part of the council, or is it not? Well, it teaches conciliarism, and that's a heresy according to the First Vatican Council. So are you saying an ecumenical council teaches heresy? Or is there some orthodox way to interpret it? Or are you just going to say that it's not part of the approved sessions of a pope? There's some evidence that some popes did approve of it. What do we do at that point? And so I remember kind of seeing those conflicts pretty early on. And it, I guess, alerted me to the fact that it's not as simple as I just thought. It maybe arrogantly thought that, yeah, you know, these Protestants are just so dumb. It's right here. It kind of showed me, well, I guess there's a little bit more to the conversation than that, right? Anyways, that's what I got for you today. Make sure to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. A lot of more good content coming your way, and I'd love to know your thoughts in the comment section. Also, if you want to support the channel and the work that I'm doing here, make sure to become a channel member. We'll see you later.